This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hey, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming to the last session of the Studies of Home seminar for this year. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Margot Finn, who is a very eminent historian of 19th and 18th century Britain and Empire. She needs no introduction from me, really. She's extremely prominent in the field. And in fact, is it recently you've become president of the Royal Historical Society?
I'm just president-elect.
Just
president in due course.
Still, no. But I mean, probably, one of the most prominent positions in our field. So, fantastic. Margot is talking this evening about her project, which looked at the East India Company at home. It's a fascinating project which has gone on at UCL over a number of years, incorporating both research on the 18th and 19th centuries, but also public history too. It's been absolutely really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more about it tonight. I don't want to say any more about it because I know you're going to talk about it now. So if I could just hand over to Margot, and if you wouldn't mind just signing in the seminar book as I circulate this as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a perfect seminar for what I've been working on for the past decade or so. So it's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to present here. I would say the presentation I'm going to give this evening isn't a formal paper. I'm going to be speaking to slides, so I have written down bits and bobs of text. That may mean that if I miss time, I may lop out a section at the end, but I will release you in good time for us to have, I hope, a good discussion at the end. And in many ways, the presentation is a hybrid of two projects that I've been working on that sometimes operate in parallel and sometimes intersect. So as Jane mentioned, I had a Leverhulme funding for a 3-year research project called the East India Company at Home that looked at the material impact on English, Scottish, Welsh, and to a much lesser extent Irish country houses of the East India Company and its politics and its material culture. And that project we're finishing the publications out of. And then I've been writing for more time than I would like to admit, a monograph on the family and the East India Company, which has a chapter on the country house as a form of property that is transformed and transmuted by the East India Company. And in some ways, what I'm giving you tonight is a dry run version of that chapter, which I haven't yet written. So I'm hoping that the questions and ideas that you bounce back at me will then feed themselves into that chapter of that book about the family and the East India Company. So my initial slide displays the Brighton Pavilion, a place that many of you, I'm sure, have visited, and a place that isn't a country house, and arguably isn't an imperial artifact, in that it's the regent, later George IV, who creates this house and was never an empire himself. And in some ways I've chosen that particular slide precisely because it is misleading. And in many ways, I think the relationship between the country house and the empire is indeed misleading. So it's an appropriate place to begin, precisely because it isn't what in some ways it appears to be. It's a pastiche in many ways of an engagement with India by somebody who was never there, and yet filled the place with objects that could never have been imagined or situated were it not for Britain's relationship with India through the East India Company. So it's both an appropriate and a appropriately misleading image, I hope, to begin with. And I'll be talking, as you can see from the title, about the country house and the empire, but I am focusing very much on the East India Company example in the particular case studies that I develop here today. Undergirding, oh dear, it's frozen.
That's it. That's it.
Good. Undergirding really today's talk and the wider projects of which it is a part is the question of what the impact of the British Empire was on Britain's domestic culture in the long 19th century or the long 18th century, depending on where you set your chronological boundaries. And on this slide, I've simply illustrated two ends of a spectrum of the answers that academics have offered to that question. On the one hand, Bernard Porter, particularly in his book The Absent-Minded Imperialists, has argued that in many ways the imperial impact in the long 19th century was nugatory, that it was very, very modest. And on the other hand, post-colonial historians, including my colleague Catherine Hall, have argued that that impact braided its way through all aspects of British identity, culture, and experience in the 19th century. And in many ways, I think that the country house is a very good optic, a very good case study to use to test those two very different ends of the spectrum. Now, the country house or the stately home is, of course, not representative of domestic culture, not representative of the home in the 19th century. So I'm not trying to claim that it stands for the rest of British culture. That would be profoundly misleading. But on the other hand, if one is thinking about empire, it's a particularly appropriate place to start. The kinds of people who played government leadership roles in the empire tended to either own, inhabit, or pass through the country houses. So they're not inappropriate in terms of thinking about the relationship between imperial power on the one hand and domestic sites on the other. It is, of course, also the case that country houses and the persons who inhabit them leave extraordinarily rich records. So it's easy to do good history. That was in quotes. Regrettably, the podcast will not hear or see those quotes. In many ways, simply because the archival record and the material culture record, and the record indeed of the structures themselves, is so very rich, so that our ability to play at the same time with space, with structure, with object, with person, with family, with lineage, is particularly rich in the country house tradition, much more than the case is of the suburban villa inhabited by the retired East India Company lower civil servant. So they're useful, I think, in those ways. And rich histories are written about them too. Rich and misleading histories are written about them. So I think they're a really useful optic, but I'm not claiming representativeness. I'm not claiming a normal paradigm when I argue for that. I'll just give you a brief outline of where I'm going with this presentation. I'm going to start with the way in which the country house became a paradigm for the nation. I'll then look at the ways in which thinking about material culture more broadly and thinking about the empire can shift us from thinking of the country house as a static national icon to thinking about the country house as a process or a series of processes. So I've called that processing the country house, and I want to destabilize that national icon, very pervasive in current media, television and film, as I'll be saying. And then I want to begin to break down some of the processes, some of the pathways by which the families I study came to own and inhabit country houses. And I think it's important there to be thinking about different pathways. There isn't one route to the country house from the East India Company. There's renting, there's buying, there's building, there's refurbishing, and very often there's a combination of those things. And they each offer a different opportunity for a different kind of material domestic engagement. And I'll try to give you some rich examples of that. Furnishing and the imperial country house aesthetic that develops, again, something I think that's very important. It's not enough to simply own. One also has to then refurbish and furnish something so the material objects come in. And then the peopling and the depopulation of the country house, also something I want to discuss. And then finally, if I have time, and I hope I do, I want to talk about co-producing richer stories of the country house for the 21st century. And I'll use an example of a project that the East India Company at Home project did at Osterley House in Hounslow in West London for that bit of the talk. So let me start with the country house as an icon of the nation. And in many ways, we can see this with India and the country house already from the establishment of Government House, Calcutta, in the very early 19th century, which is on the right. I'm slightly discombobulated by looking at the screen there, and is based on Kettleston Hall. So that we have a family house, an 18th century family house. The Curzons at this stage don't have the relationship with India that they will have by the early 20th century. But nonetheless, Government House, Calcutta, when you determine the seat of British government in the company era, what do you do to choose to embody that architecturally? Well, you choose the country house as the architectural style and the exemplar that you will use. So I think we can see that quite early on, the nation putting itself in India in terms of its governmentality, casting itself in the form of an imperial country house. But arguably the moment that most made the country house the icon of the English nation, and English I think I use here advisedly, though one can argue it for Scotland as well, was Roy Strong's very, very powerful V&A exhibition of 1974 about the destruction of a country house. The exhibition ran from 74 to 75 and led to the exhibition catalogue, The Destruction of the Country House, a very, very powerful intervention by a museum, by a repository of objects of that country house tradition. What were the characteristics of Strong et al.'s vision of the country house and its place in the nation? I think the most striking thing, if one reads the catalogue of the exhibition, was the extent to which it presented the country house as a stable icon of the nation. We see here in this quote, like our parish churches, the country houses seem always to have been there since time immemorial. And Strong was much too good an historian, I suspect, to have believed this particular version that he's presenting there. He knew perfectly well that the country house changed over time. But the presentation in many ways in the exhibition and the catalogue was this stable icon of the nation that did not change over time. And that's really in many ways become the way in which popular media very often present the country house. On the one hand as timeless and stable, and on the other hand as under threat, whether it's by industrialization, by foreigners, by modernity writ large. And again, other examples from the catalogue from that exhibition. It has repeatedly been stated, those of you who teach students know that whenever the passive voice creeps in, one always already has to become suspicious. So it has repeatedly been stated, by whom, in what context, one might ask, that it's England's unique contribution to the visual arts. That's a very big statement for a director of the V&A to be making. English country houses, whether palaces or manors, epitomize English history. So you have a collapsing, a conflation on the one hand of the country house and of all of English history on the other. And it is purely fortuitous that the decline, or is it purely fortuitous, that the decline of our civilization and the collapse of the country house way of life are coincidental? And again, if one thinks of the timing of this, of course, 1974, it's a decade after post-colonialism had really come home to roost. So it's a particular moment in time that I think allows one to make the claim to the timelessness, to the iconic national identity of the country house. And Strong's exhibition really made a big imprint. You still, I still hear at V&A meetings people talking about going to that exhibition. It's really a very, very powerful statement made by the museum. And then finally, the country house truly epitomizes, Strong argued, all those aspects of the British achievement in the decorative arts which find its national archive in the V&A Museum. And one of the things I want us to do in thinking about this presentation is to think about what is the role of the country house in preserving the country house? What is the role of the museum in preserving and interpreting the country house? And then what is our role, either as members of the public or as academic historians, or as other historians, in preserving, interpreting that country house, and how do those things fit together? So, popular media have really taken the strong view of the country house and run with it in many ways. Gosford Park, a particularly shameless or perhaps shameful variation of that, but Downton Abbey is my favourite, unfavourite one. And I think, again, here I think there's a conflation between the national treasure, Maggie Smith as our national treasure, and the Highclere, the house as a national treasure, and this icon becomes something that's both peopled, architecturally embodied, and situated in a particular time. And I haven't, I cannot stand Downton Abbey, so I haven't watched enough of them. But the storyline, to the extent that I can tell, is a storyline in which an Indian person does emerge in the form of an Indian Indian prince, and he's a sexual predator. He's not meant to be there. He's out of place at this particular country house. And there's a very, very dominant narrative in that way that writes the East India Company and the Indian Empire out of the country house, or pushes it to the dangerous margins. The country house under threat is what's happening there. Whereas the white working class, the servants, literally here in Gosford Park, massed on the staircase, are a part of what makes the country house English and what preserves it. Just as, of course, working class servants did preserve the country house on a daily basis. So, obviously, historians and curators in museums have been challenging that view for many, many years now, and I've just given you there a few examples of how they've begun to historicize the country house, to recognize it is located in different periods of time. Peter Mandler's Fall and Rise of the Stately Home, a very good example of that. And at the V&A itself, Michael Snodden and John Stiles gave a version in the new British Galleries of country house material culture that was fundamentally about change. And there's a wonderful video by Michael Snodden that I've given you the URL there, where he literally begins by talking about the change within the country house tradition. So in opposition to the Roy Strong version, which was all about stasis and about the national icon being stable, albeit under threat, Snodden and John Stiles, in their thinking with objects, were very much looking at change over time. All of these critiques of the ahistorical, timeless national icon, however, remained within the national envelope, so that all of them were thinking about the nation as the political, geopolitical envelope in which we need to think the country house. And it's in that context that very interesting work began to be done about quantitative and economic parameters. Who could afford to produce a country house? Was country house culture an open elite, as the Stones asked, or was it in fact a closed shop? And these kinds of questions were being asked again within a national envelope. You'll notice that both of these are looking at the English country house. One can find equivalents for the Scots, but nobody at this stage was really thinking about pushing the country house beyond England or beyond Britain. They were not thinking about pushing it into the empire. That began to change really in the early parts of this decade. Madge Dresser and Andrew Hahn of English Heritage ran a big project looking for the legacies of slavery in the English country house and the Scottish country house, and produced a big open access, readily available, well illustrated set of essays. Stephanie Barshevsky, more recently, has written a big book about country houses in the British Empire, and then our East India Company at Home project sought to do that from the perspective of India. I would say that the concept of the imperial country house, one that I have in my own title, is fundamentally problematic. The Caribbean and the country house is a very different history, a very different story than the East India Company and the country house. Those are not equivalents, and I think we have to begin to break down some of those big rubrics. In order to think productively about the country house, I think we also have to think outside history. And I've simply thrown down there in a scandalously schematic manner some of the ways that we could do so. Thinking with Judith Butler means thinking about the performance of identities in country houses. Who performs them? What identities? Is it just class? Is it just race? Is it just gender? Can we go beyond that? Michel de Certeau, thinking about the everyday experience of domestic spaces, the ways in which we don't consciously think about all of the things that we do in 3 dimensions with objects. Bruno Latour, thinking about objects and persons acting in concert to have agency rather than agency residing in humans alone. Doreen Massey, thinking about space as not being something that's inert and just there, but something that is constructed through our engagement with, for example, country houses. And then Danny Miller, the comfort of things. I want to come back to that because the country house in political ideology is so comforting. What lends the country house its comfort, I would ask? And do we maybe need to make it a little bit less comfortable? Barshevsky's very helpfully, though it's a problematic statistic, all statistics about the country house and the East India Company or the country house and empire are problematic, has tried to plot the acquisition of country houses by hers is an imperial cohort, not just an East India Company one, with very interesting results. Basically, her statistics suggest that between 6 and 10% of the country houses purchased in the Georgian era in particular are purchased with imperial wealth. And it would be interesting to think about why the Georgian era is that particular peak in her data. And I just want to say that by way of framing. Where's Wally? This is, I think, the key question to ask about why we don't know very much about the empire or the East India Company and the country house. Sezencut, on one side of your slides, looks like an East India Company house, and indeed it is. It's built through an Indian imperial aesthetic on East India Company money. That's a very easy thing to call an East India Company house. Swallowfield in Berkshire, which is on the other side, however, is as much purchased, refashioned, rebuilt, and furnished on East India Company wealth, and it just looks like your bog standard Georgian exterior. So we can't read the East India Company, we can't read the Caribbean, we can't read Kenya off an country house, even when it is conspicuously there. And sometimes that's as true of the interior as it is of the exterior. So how we learn to read for the empire or the company and the country house is, I think, an important question. As I mentioned earlier on, there are multiple pathways to possession, and we need to think about those as well. Obviously, using East India Company wealth to build a house is an obvious example of the relationship between the two. Redcliffe Towers in Devon is a very, very late example by a retired East India Company colonel. He leaves the East India Company service almost on the cusp of the East India Company being demolished and replaced by Crown rule. And it's an amazing edifice. Obviously a lot of money, a lot of thought. Thought perhaps was in quotes again, goes into the architecture of this building. It's now a hotel. Many of these East India Company structures are now, if they're not in private hands, either hotels or conference centers or schools. And it's interesting to think about the 21st century version of the Imperial Country House in that context. Touche, on the other hand, a Scottish house not that far from Aberdeen, which is now a major conference centre. You can also go there to shoot. Touche was very much a house that was owned by the family, by the Setons, when they went to India, but they went to India only to preserve it, only to save it. It was only by going out to Empire that they could afford to keep this pile together. And Archibald Seton, who was the resident or the chief East India Company diplomat at Delhi, scrupulously sends his fortune home to his sister Barbara so that she can rebuild Touche. Seton never lives to see the house. He sends back very precise, detailed plans, including plans for showers, something unknown of in Scotland at this time period, but well known in India. And so Touche gets its showers and its complete refurbishment through the East India Company money, but never sees its East India Company man back there. And its history is clearly in East India Company history, but again it's not visible on the surface of the building, and no person from the East India Company ever actually lives there. So we need to find alternative ways of finding these alternative pathways. Here I've given you simply two different versions of Scottish country houses. Country houses is a little bit of a misnomer for Falcon Hall, which only has about 30 acres attached to it when it initially is purchased. But they come from the same year and they tell very interesting stories. Minto is the family home of the first Earl Minto, who serves as Governor General in India in the early 19th century. And again, sends huge sums, hundreds of thousands of pounds, which is millions of thousands of pounds in today's currency, back to his wife and his eldest son in Minto to rebuild, refurbish Minto as the family home. And he's very explicit about that. He builds it bigger so that he can have the entire family and multiple generations living together in the home, which in Government House in Calcutta is exactly what he's doing, albeit in Government House in Calcutta, he's got his bastard sons there with him as well as his legitimate ones, and that's not something that's going to happen in the Scottish borders. And I'll come back to that point in a little bit. Falcon Hall, very, very interesting, because that's a Highland Scot whose family is very closely tied both to the East India Company and to Caribbean slavery, and he remakes himself as an Edinburgh Lowland Scot through his East India Company service. So we've got these navigations within the nation as well as navigations within the empire. Histories of these houses are extraordinarily helpful and profoundly misleading. The Glasgow Gentry Homes is a wonderful compendium. It's available online of Glasgow genteel homes. Loads of those homes come from Caribbean slaveholders, but a surprising number of them, given that we tend to think of Glasgow as attached to the Atlantic trade, are East India Company homes as well. And these, of course, are mercantile homes representing themselves as gentry already by 1870. Similarly, again, available online, Lady Russell's house, Swallowfield and its owners, Swallowfield in Berkshire, which I showed you an image of a little bit earlier on. She rewrites the family history as a history that is chapter upon chapter as a history of the English royal family. So she points out that Swallowfield was in the dowry of several of the wives of Henry VIII. She tells the story of Thomas Diamond Pitt owns the house, and his son owns it after him. And she tells that story writ large. Mentions in two sentences the fact that for 2 generations the family is then owned by Caribbean slaveholders, and tells the story of Henry Russell, to whom I'll return, resident or chief East India Company diplomat at Hyderabad, who, with his father, who had been Supreme Court Justice in Calcutta, and his brother, who had been in the East India Company military, they put their money together in order to be able to buy Swallowfield. Much of that history gets written out of Swallowfield and its owners, which is instead told in terms of the royal family, the Earl of Clarendon, famous Tory historian of the state, a little bit on Thomas Diamond Pitt, and a lot on Wilkie and Dickens and the other people who visit. So the writing out of the empire history in the history of the empire home is one of the stories that we have to, I think with when we think about this. So I want to turn now from the exterior of the home, the purchasing of the home, the remodeling of the home, to the populating of the home, first with objects and then with persons. Chintz, I think, provides us with a good example of the what's actually in these homes, but also the problem of what's in these homes. Chintz, of course, in the 18th century is a luxury item that you import from India, and by the early 19th century, it's an object that you manufacture in England. And it's those two, it's the real and the knockoff, the genuine and the substitute, import substitution, that we have to think with when we think about the empire home. What is real in terms of an oriental object in an East India Company home? Nothing illustrates this better, I think, than Chinese wallpaper. Even 10 years ago, we thought of Chinese wallpaper as perhaps vulgar, but original, real, an example of Chinese culture in the country house. And the more that we learn about Chinese wallpaper, the more we realize that it's something that's fashioned for a European audience. So asking questions about the chronology of objects such as Chinese wallpaper. We used to think that the craze for Chinese wallpaper died out really with George IV. In fact, Chinese wallpaper continues to be papered over in country house walls well into the 20th century. And again, we don't know that periodicity, but we know that it happens throughout the entire period. And Brighton Pavilion is only one example of its use in the home. What does it say to put Chinese wallpaper up on your walls? What is being said there? How do we read that as a text? We have very little research on that. We're much better at reading textiles, much better at reading porcelain. Chinese wallpaper, however, is notoriously difficult to date. Unless somebody's written on the back of it something about paying tax, we just don't know how old it is. So it's a very, very problematic way of trying to tell that story. This is the armorial porcelain from Osterley House, produced in Jindijin. The object that is authentic, the one that's actually produced in China, that's a process. Again, not a thing, but a process, and it's a process that takes about 4 years. You send your armorial out on a supercargo, on a merchant of the East India Company vessel. He gets it taken to Jindijin, where the porcelain is made. A sort of proof copy is created of a couple of your plates by artisans who do not read English and are not familiar with European iconography. It's sent back to you. That'll take about 2 years, all told, that transit. You proofread it because some of it's wrong. Some of those images, your armorial is not correct. It's sent back again under the aegis of the supercargo. It's corrected and it's sent back to you. It takes about 4 years to get your set of armorial porcelain. And of course, by the early 19th century, import substitution again has happened. When you break your Jindijin plates, you can now get Wedgwood or another to make versions of them for you. And at Osterley, unless you flip them over onto the back, you can't tell which is which. And I think when we think about the country house, we need to think about questions of authenticity. Which one is real? They were both used in the house, so they're both real. But which one is the East India Company object? The one that dates from 1720, and that's very early for armorial wear, that's something that you only got because you were in bed with the East India Company. It was only the supercargoes who could give you access to those objects. You have to be connected to the company. You cannot buy that plate on an open market. So you've got a gifting and a patronage culture that's leading to the population of the country house with objects in this time period. Families tell rich stories about these objects, and the Attar task of Tipu Sultan, which is in the British Museum, is one such object. Most families that's an exaggeration, many East India Company families tell stories about the sword of Tipu Sultan that is in their collection, and it was found on the body of Tipu Sultan when he died. Tipu Sultan, it has been suggested, might have died of the sheer weight of the many swords that supposedly he had on his body from the country house. So these objects are fantastically important in unpicking the story of the East India Company and the country house, and they're often fundamentally false. And that falseness is itself, of course, an interesting history, an important part of that history. But digging down into the real sword of Tipu Sultan is also an important story and much harder to do. So thinking with the narratives of objects is an integral part of the country house, but we can't simply read that history off the object, nor can we even read it off the so-called provenance that the family has. Now, I want to go back to Swallowfield and Berkshire and talk you through some objects and some constellations of objects to pick up on some of these three themes. So Henry Russell, the second baronet, was the resident or the chief diplomat in Hyderabad from about 1810 until 1820, when he leaves under something of a cloud, as I'll mention in a few moments. And he, his father, and his brother club together with the East India Company fortunes, and they buy this Tudor in origin pile in Berkshire and convert it into a family seat. And they expend huge sums of this East India Company fortune to do so. One of the key ways in which they do so is through fine art. And I think that we, as those of us who do material culture, we tend to often put fine art up on a wall and not put it into engagement with the other forms of material culture that we do. And I think that's a real mistake, as we can see through Russell's deployment of this vast income to repaint the family history, literally as well as figuratively. So Russell's mother was the sister of the first Earl Whitworth, probably the most prestigious member of his family. And one of the first things that he does when he begins to come into his inheritance in the 1830s at Swallowfield is to pay David Wilkie to repaint a number of the family portraits. So the Earl Whitworth, they have an unfinished painting portrait by Lawrence, and Wilkie is brought in to sort of tart that up in some ways. Much more, I'll come to my second repainting in a moment. The Romney painting of the little Henry before he's breeched with his mother is also enjoys pride of place in the new refurbished Swallowfield Hall. So her brother is the first Earl Whitworth, and they're sat next to each other or near to each other on the walls. And this is creating a family lineage through the paintings. And when the portrait that I just showed you is sold, one of the things that increases its price, it sells for a good sum, is its strong provenance. And I've given you here the blurb from William Wallace, the salesrooms in Salisbury that sell the object. And there's a strong provenance of the family's memories of this portrait being painted. Now, this is something that Henry Russell was, of course, 3 to 4 at the time that the portrait was painted. So the provenance is both true and highly problematic, is I suppose what I would say there. Also interesting, and I don't have a portrait of this, so I've substituted here Lady Lyndhurst, is the painting by Wilkie, the repainting by Wilkie of Russell's paternal grandmother. So about the same time as this is done, Russell commissions Wilkie to repaint Granny. And he does so in a way, Wilkie does so in a way to make her more genteel. So we have literally a record which has an excellent provenance. We can trace it, but the provenance is of falsification. In other bits of the correspondence, her fingers are not sufficiently genteel in the original version, and Wilkie is clearly trying to paint this family into its country house. So we have a rather interesting a series of processes occurring there. Much more closely tied to the actual history of the East India Company and proudly displayed in the home until it was sold for a record price is this silver gilt presentation vase presented by the military men of the Hyderabad escort, so that's the residency escort, to Henry Russell in 1820, 1821. And this is something that's written up in the family histories as one of the great ways of exemplifying the pride and imperial participation there. It has a very, very strong provenance when it sells, and this is attention is drawn to this. The sales room, as the William Wallace News noted in 2010, gross $1 million a week, and a large part of this amount is due to this item from the Russell collection with its absolutely pristine provenance. Part of the provenance comes from Lady Russell's history of the house. She describes here, both in a connoisseurial term and detailed terms about the object itself, but also describes it as being capable of telling a story. So we have this object, I'm going to go back to it, capable by its shape, its format, and what we know about it as telling a story. Well, it does tell a story, but it also doesn't tell a story. The story it doesn't tell is that Russell was sacked from Hyderabad. He had completely, without the authority to do so, ordered that 2 Indian robbers in the Hyderabad bazaar each receive 1,000 lashes for having been found robbing in the bazaar. The first of them died within about 12 hours, and the second died within 36 hours, so he loses his job. And that's also the story of the vase, but it's obviously not the story of the family history. So if we think of the presentation vase and what it does tell us and what it doesn't tell us, both embodied there, I think, very well. And the Court of Directors, it must be said, is furious at him, will not re-employ him for what he's done. So it's not a simple matter of bad imperialists, versus virtuous Indian robbers. I'm not trying to tell that story, but the story of the object and its provenance is so much more complicated than what we see in the family history of it. I'll just note also that knockoff versions of these Renaissance paintings were also purchased by Russell on the continent with his East India Company fortune in the 1930s. One of the crucial things we have to remember in these times of Brexit is how European the English aesthetic of the country house is. So putting together the empire and the European and the English is something we have to do when we think about performances of identity. Now, before I turn to the final section, I want to look briefly at the peopling of these English country houses. Here we have Swallowfield in the English Hindustan, as Berkshire is often referred to because it has so many retired company servants in the 19th century. Who actually inhabited this house? Well, it's inhabited by, at any one time, usually at least one, but often up to 3 generations of the Russell family. And that the property, the company fortune with which they purchased the house also flows into other country houses throughout the country. One of the things that makes it difficult to track that wealth is that a lot of it passes through daughters, through dowries. And those kinds of links manifest themselves very poorly and very irregularly in the historical record. So I've simply chosen the country house built by the husband of one of the other Russell daughters, one of Sir Henry's sisters, and that's Whittington Hall in Lancashire. This is probably Henry Russell of the robbers in Hyderabad's wife, together with his sister and perhaps another sister there in the 1840s. So through the dowry, we also get a number of East India Company houses that don't manifest as East India country houses, something that's worth thinking about. This is a lovely domestic scene. This is what we want to think about when we think about the home. This is comfort, surely. And then there is the question of the family members who don't make it into the house. This is the very famous image of the Kirkpatrick children. Kirkpatrick was Russell's predecessor as diplomat or as resident at Hyderabad, and Kirkpatrick famously had a liaison, perhaps was married to a Hyderabadi princess with whom he had 2 children, who he sent back home to England. And before they were sent back home, they were painted. And the painting becomes a matter of hot contestation between Henry Russell, who succeeds Kirkpatrick as diplomat and also as lover of the children's mother. And the mother desperately wants the painting of the children. The children have been taken from her. Henry repeatedly refuses. Henry is a bastard, it must be said, not legally, but in personality. Refuses to give her the painting, and the painting ends up in Swallowfield of these mixed-race children by his mistress, by another man. A very interesting story going on there. Henry himself, however, also has a mixed-race daughter who he sends back to England, to Clapham. So you have on the one hand the country house in Berkshire and the English Hindustan, and on the other hand you have the mixed-race daughter who he doesn't acknowledge, who he sets up in Clapham, training her up to be a governess. Never meets her, categorically refuses to meet her, has one of his mates become her a protector. And there's an extensive correspondence. She's called Mary Wilson, so again she doesn't bear his surname. Extensive correspondence in which he tries to say again and again, I'm doing the right thing, I'm doing the proper thing, but she needs to support herself, she needs to be able to manage on a salary. Excruciating correspondence from Mary herself to this protector, saying again and again she wants to know who she is, doesn't know who her parents are, remembers life in the Hyderabad residency, that's the big country house, the big urban country house in Hyderabad, And as her marriage approaches, she's quite canny, begins to say things such as, well, I will need to put down my father's name and profession on the marriage certificate. And Henry is absolutely having none of it, as we can see here. But crucially, when he adduces to her protector the reason why he cannot name her as his child, that is the country house. If I named her as my child, he says, I would be expected to invite her into my home. My wife will not have it so long as our daughters are unmarried. So here we have the country house, the domestic site, as a site of exclusion from the family. It marks not only inclusion but also exclusion in the life of Mary Wilson. Now, I want to just spend about 5 minutes asking you and asking myself, what do we do in the 21st century with the country house? How do we tell a history of the country house that recognizes that it is and does and has functioned as a national icon, and it was and is also an imperial and a global phenomenon and process? How do we try and work with the National Trust? How do we try and work with English heritage? How do we try and work with other communities to try and tell those contested, problematic, hidden, illusory histories in a way that thinks about the country house as process, not as reified thing, a historicized thing? And to try and do that, the East India Company at Home project worked together with an amazing team at Osterley House, which is a National Trust house, and which has always been presented as being fundamentally English or European. So Osterley, which is in Hounslow and in West London, was purchased as an Elizabethan pile, essentially, by Francis Child the Elder, a major city banker. And the family bank is always the economic rubric under which the house's story has been told. Its other narrative line has always been Robert Adam and the neoclassical tradition. And indeed it is emphatically a Robert Adam neoclassical house. It's rebuilt and refashioned by Adam in the 1770s, 1780s, and it's stamped by Robert Adam all over. And of course Adam we think of as being Scottish, British, and European, not necessarily in that order. And crucially, the House and Collections Curator and other staff at Osterley were interested in retelling that story, not as an East India Company story instead, and I'll explain in a moment why one would do that, but as at one and the same time a neoclassical Robert Adam home and an East India Company home. So we wrote a new history of the house on the website, but not yet in the visitor manual. So it's not the public history that you go, it's not the history that you're told when you go to Osterley, but it's certainly available. We began to work with the curators and the people who present the house to look at the things that are in plain view that tell you that this is an East India Company home. It's chock-a-block full of very early lacquerware. It's just all over the place. And armorial lacquerware as well. Again, the chair dates from early in the 18th century. You simply can't get your hands on this stuff in the early 18th century unless you're a company family. This is not something that's on the market at the time. And we began to ask questions about, well, what is authentic? What is indigenous? What is native in Osterley? All of the paintings in Osterley are faux. That's not to say they're not real paintings. They are real paintings. None of them are native to the house. All of the paintings were sold when the family was strapped for cash. On the other hand, the huge Chinese parade jars, which you can see there, and opposite them and not in view, huge ivory Chinese junks. All of those are native to the house, and they come to the house through the East India Company connection. So what we see when we go into a house isn't, it is what's there, but it isn't what's true in an historical sense if we think about provenance and the family history. And as part of this rethinking of the house, we began to think about what's there. This is one of the Robert Adam rooms. It's full of Etruscan-ish walls. It's full of Chippendale furniture, again, which Adam was perfectly fine with. But the Chippendale furniture is made of Chinese lacquer, which Adam it doesn't really go with the neoclassical tradition, to put it mildly. As part of this project, we began to get members of the local community, many of whom are South Asian, to come into the house and to do oral histories of their own transit to Hounslow with objects from Asia. It's very interesting what rooms people picked to have their photographs taken with. This is the morning room. It had been completely stripped out. And this particular member of the project wanted to have this very vibrant photograph taken against a backdrop in which Austerley in some ways had been stripped out from itself. We ran an exhibition in which, as I say, we were trying to do these two things at once. One was to tell the story of the Robert Adam House, but as a house that was braided together with the East India Company history through the trappings of trade. And I suppose the high point of us for us in many ways was that after the exhibition had closed, the local Gurdwara, the local Sikh temple, took the part of the exhibition that we could move and displayed it in the temple. And this is an illustration of that. For each person who participated with an oral history, they brought an object in. This gentleman, sadly now deceased, brought in a global history of his family that he had written, and that was his object. So by his choice, we sat him in the library to have his photo taken. So, 4 questions off the top of my head. You may wish to ask me other ones, and I am open for discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.